This is not a war that has been thought through at all. And my fear is that the Iranian regime still has the capacity to really cause a tremendous amount of chaos in the Gulf.
Bernard Haykel, a Middle East expert who's following events in Iran and is in regular contact with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince. Can I ask you which of those scenarios you think is the most likely?
My bet is that this regime will survive, that this is a very tough regime that still has at least 20% of the population on side and is willing to kill to remain in power. And I think what MBS will be doing now is telling Trump that we don't want chaos in Iran.
From Bloomberg Weekend, this is the Mishal Husain Show. If, like me, you've been watching events in the Middle East this week, there has been so much to take in. The strikes by Israel and the United States are of a different order to what we saw last year. In Iran, the authorities say hundreds of people have been killed. And Iran's retaliation has seen targets struck in many countries: Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Saudi Arabia, which makes this a wide conflict, a complex picture, one that could have consequences for even years to come. And so obviously we wanted to talk about it, to try at least to make sense not only of what's happening now, but where it's all heading. And that's when I thought of Professor Bernard Haykel, who has studied the Middle East for decades. He's Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University and someone who looks at the politics of the region with knowledge of its history, its religions, culture, social change. He has a deep understanding of Iran and a particular insight into Saudi Arabia, the biggest country in the region, because he talks and WhatsApps regularly with its powerful Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. Now, right at the end of this, we get to Bernard Haykel's own personal connection with the countries he writes about. But I hope you get from the conversation what I did, some clarity at a turbulent time. Tell me, first of all, Professor Haykel, what it was like when you heard the news last Saturday that the US and Israel had begun striking Iran. What were the first thoughts that went through your mind?
I wasn't surprised that this attack happened. I was only surprised by how soon it did, given that they were still negotiating. The Iranians were negotiating with the Americans. But, word among the leaders in the Gulf states, people like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, was that Israel would sooner or later attack because Iran is at its weakest. They had knocked out most of its, if not all of its, air defenses last June. And that this was an opportunity to really destroy and defeat the system itself and to topple the regime. The surprise was more to do with timing and also the fact that the Americans were all in on this because it was primarily an Israeli decision to attack, I think.
Were you surprised, though, by how fast it spread to other countries, that because of the Iranian retaliation, we soon had all these other countries in the region which found that they were being struck?
Yes. Only in as much as the Iranian regime felt existentially threatened. The Iranians have been saying this, by the way, to all the leaders in the Arab world, that if they are existentially threatened, that they will attack broadly and widely and try to disrupt oil shipments and gas shipments, and they would do exactly what has happened and what is still happening. I also knew that within the regime in Iran that there were sort of two factions. One faction basically said that the response to the killing of Qasem Soleimani by President Trump in the first term, this is the head of the Quds force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and then later the 12-day war of last year, that the response of the Iranians was very muted and that basically had encouraged the Israelis and the Americans to feel that they were undeterred and that they would attack again. So the other faction in Iran that's more, say, forward-leaning or more aggressive said, this time if they attack us, we're really going to have to respond. Otherwise, we have no deterrence whatsoever.
Or maybe also it's almost a question of reputation and there's something perhaps almost, primeval that comes out of like, you just do want to show that you've got it in you to fight back.
Yes, and also I think that within Iran itself, the longer-range ballistic missiles had been very seriously destroyed by the Israelis in the 12-day war of last June. the Iranians now have a much larger arsenal of short-range missiles and drones that hadn't been damaged. So that's why you're seeing so many more missiles going at the UAE and at Bahrain and Kuwait and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, because that's the arsenal that the Iranians actually still have, relatively speaking, large numbers of.
Before we dive deeper into many facets of what you've set out, Bernard, I want to ask about how you see a moment like this with your knowledge and expertise, because you've studied history, you've studied Islam. So
yes.
When you see the news, are you always using that longer lens, that looking back in time, putting it in that kind of context?
I mean, yes, these are modern states and their ideologies, including the Iranian state. You know, its ideology draws on a particular cherry-picked version of Islam, but it's a modern state and it's a modern ideology. And I see the Middle East as riven or divided between two groups or two ideologies, two ways of looking at the world. So you have the status quo powers. Those are powers that basically want to develop their countries and they want peace and stability to economically advance. And they include Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, also the UAE, despite what they're doing in Sudan and Yemen. And then you have this other group that is revisionist. I would call them revisionist in the sense that they want to redraw the map of the Middle East. They want to change the power dynamics in the Middle East. And they include, surprisingly, both Iran and the Israeli right wing. And the Iranians want to see Israel destroyed. They want to see America thrown out of the region militarily, as well as its economic and political and cultural influence. And the Israelis also, the right wing in Israel, also wants to reshape and reimagine the Middle East according to its own political agenda. And so what we're seeing today is one of the revisionist powers, that is the Israelis, attempting to do just that, to destroy the Iranian regime and to see either something replace it or chaos for that matter. And that's a real fear of mine, is that if you end up with a failed state in Iran with 92 million people, you could end up with a catastrophic situation for Iranians and for the neighbors.
It's interesting to me that you do call Iran a modern state, because in so many ways its structure, the theocracy, the fact that it has had in the form of Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader and Ayatollah at the top of the pyramid. Should we not see it as a theocracy? Should we see it as a modern nation state in which the leadership are called names other than what we're used to?
So it is a theocracy in as much as you have a cleric who heads it, now a dead cleric, in Khamenei, and before him Khomeini. But if you look at the ideology of Iran, of the state, you see it's a combination of different strands. So you have anti-imperialism, you have anti-colonialism. These are modern ideologies. You have social justice ideas from communism and Marxism. Those are modern as well. But you also have elements of pre-modern medieval theology as well that are repackaged in a modern guise. And then you also have Iranian nationalism, which is, again, a modern ideology, not an ancient one. So what you have is sort of a hybrid regime in Iran in its ideology. And this is true, by the way, of other Islamist ideologies like the Muslim Brotherhood, is a combination of elements of traditional Islam with modern ideologies.
Let's dig in then to the peril of this moment and the complexity of this moment, particularly in relation to Iran. I think for most people, what they're imagining is either the regime survives or it doesn't survive. And if it doesn't survive, then most people hope something better comes out of that.
Right.
You're raising the prospect that the state could fail and there is just anarchy?
Yes. So I think there are three possibilities from what we're seeing today. So the regime survives as it is and gets hardened even further in its determination to be a revisionist power and the theocracy that Ayatollah Khomeini set up in 1979, with the Revolutionary Guard Corps in control and a cleric as a supreme leader. So that's one possibility. The other is a Venezuela-like solution. So the regime stays, but you have a new leadership that's much more nationalist, less revolutionary, and that is willing to cut deals with the Trump administration. That's what I just termed the Venezuela solution. So same regime, but reformed. And the third possibility is the falling of the regime or the downfall of the regime. And in that case, you could end up with a civil war. You could end up with different ethnicities. Iran is only about 50% Persian by ethnicity. So you have other ethnicities, the Baluch, the Kurds, the Azeris, the Arabs, and they could be armed by outside powers, and you could end up with a very chaotic and a very weakened central state. And that would spell a disaster for Iran and for the region itself. Because Iran is a large country with a super talented population and has massive resources in oil and gas. And seeing a Libya-style war in Iran would be catastrophic.
Can I ask you which of those three scenarios at this point in time you think is the most likely?
My bet is that this regime will survive, that this is a very tough regime that still has at least 20% of the population on side and is willing to kill to remain in power. And we saw this in the response to the demonstrations that took place in January. The regime was willing to kill tens of thousands of its own citizens. So this is not a regime that's going to easily disappear. It has deep roots in Iranian society. And, frankly, it has delivered, despite all its problems, it has delivered on basic services for its population, whether it's healthcare, education, and basic infrastructure. So I don't see it disappearing. I think the Americans are hoping for a Venezuela-like reformed regime. And the Israelis probably would prefer a chaos in Iran.
But if that first scenario of yours, the survival of the regime and the possible strengthening, is the most likely in your view, we will be asking in time, what was this war for?
Yeah, I don't think the Americans, by the way, have thought through, that is the Trump administration, have thought through the scenarios for after this war at all. I think they just went into this thinking it would be a very quick and easy decapitation of the leader and that somehow the regime would immediately come to a Venezuela-like accommodation with the Americans. But even President Trump said that the success of that initial attack that killed Ayatollah Khamenei was so successful that, they knocked out several of the potential leaders who they were hoping to take over the regime and then make this accommodation. So this is not a war that has been thought through at all. And my fear is that the Iranian regime still has a capacity to really cause a tremendous amount of chaos in the Gulf. And we see this now with the Strait of Hormuz is blocked. No one will insure a ship going through there. And that's about 20% of global oil and a lot of the world's gas. And so we're going to see a lot of chaos if this war doesn't end soon.
Can I ask you, Bernard, to explain something else that we've been seeing in a number of countries, India, Pakistan, Yemen, Turkey, Iraq, Nigeria, and that is Shia Muslims protesting and publicly mourning the Ayatollah. Now, would you say that is religious or political or a mixture? How should we understand it?
So the Ayatollah in Iran subscribes to a particular version of 12er Shia Islam. And the doctrine itself is called Wilayat al-Faqih, which means the guardianship of the jurist. This is a distinctive modern doctrine that Ayatollah Khamenei came up with. And most Shia in the world, most 12er Shias in the world, and they represent about 15% of the Muslim population in the world, don't adhere to this doctrine. They don't see it as legitimate. But they have tremendous affinity and affection for the regime in Iran and for the leadership of the regime, even though theologically they're not connected to it. So I see most of the Shia lamentation and response to what is happening in Iran and the killing of Khamenei as more political than theological.
It is then directly against the United States and Israel. It is not just mourning for a spiritual leader.
Yeah, it is more of a political sentiment. And it's one, by the way, that's shared by others. I mean, people who see Iran as a country that is resisting empire, that's resisting Israel, that's resisting colonialism, have tremendous sympathy for Iran. People who identify with it on that basis as well. So you'll have many leftists, for instance, who will feel very sad about what's happening in Iran and the death of its leader.
Let's talk then about Saudi Arabia and particularly about the leadership of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. You've got a forthcoming book about Saudi Arabia today, and you do talk to the Crown Prince on a one-to-one basis. First of all, can you give us your sense of these conflicting reports about what Mohammed bin Salman wanted to happen between the US and Israel and Iran, whether he was behind the scenes pushing for these strikes on Iran.
Yes. So I've spoken to Mohammed bin Salman specifically about this issue over the last 2 or 3 years. And he's been very clear and categorical that he does not want a war with Iran. He does not want Israel to attack Iran. And that he has tried to reduce tensions with Iran. And you see this in a détente agreement that was signed in March of 2023 with the help of the Chinese that reopened embassies between Saudi Arabia and Iran and resumed visas and so on.
Which was a really striking moment given their relationship over a long period of time.
That's right. I mean, the regime in Iran since the time of Ayatollah Khamenei, so since 1979, has vilified Saudi Arabia and the rulers in Saudi Arabia and seeing them as illegitimate puppets of the West. And even Ayatollah Khamenei used very abusive terms when referring to the Saudi royal family, calling them the camel grazers of Najd, Najd being the central province of Saudi Arabia. And so the history is one of great tension. And initially, when King Salman, the father of Mohammed bin Salman, acceded to the throne in 2015, Mohammed bin Salman, he's known as MBS in the West, actually attacked Iran verbally and compared Ayatollah Khamenei to Hitler and said that, we'll take the fight to them if they fight us, and so on. And then he toned down his rhetoric and then tried to reestablish better relations with the Iranians. Those relations having broken off in 2017 when a prominent Shiite cleric in Saudi Arabia was executed for resistance to the regime and for promoting revolution to the regime, according to the Saudis. Anyway, MBS realizes that Iran has this arsenal of short-range missiles, that they can do a tremendous amount of damage to not just his oil facilities, but also his vital installations like desalination plants, electricity generation plants, communication systems, and so on. And he has no effective way of blocking that swarm of attack that the Iranians can send against Saudi Arabia. And we saw this in September 2019 when the Iranians, in a display of their firepower, attacked a major oil separation facility in Saudi Arabia called Abqaiq and damaged it very severely and knocked out 50% of their production. So he's very wary and worried about what Iran can do, and so did not want a war. So the Washington Post article saying that MBS was supporting an attack on Iran is not true.
You're sure of that?
Absolutely.
Their reporting was that 4 people familiar with the matter said that he made multiple private phone calls to Trump over the past month advocating a US attack. I mean, the Saudis have pushed back against this publicly. You're sure that version's true?
Yeah, he did call Trump several times asking him not to attack. So that's the true version of it. And he, having said that, he also warned the Iranians, because the Iranians did threaten him, that if they are existentially threatened, that they would attack him. And he warned the Iranians that if they were to attack him, he would have to defend himself and that he would launch attacks against Iran. And I think that's exactly what's likely to happen. You're going to see the Saudi Air Force getting involved in this war on the side of both the US and Israel. He is a nationalist, MBS is a nationalist, and he has to show his own population that he can defend the country against these attacks, because the attacks have been on civilian targets and industrial targets. The major oil refinery has been attacked, and so on. And so he needs to, like the Iranians, reestablish deterrence vis-a-vis Iran.
That would be another widening of this war.
Yes. Yeah, and I think we're going to see that if the Iranians don't stop soon, and if this war doesn't stop soon, you will see a widening of it, and you'll see Gulf states involved in defending themselves. And so this was his fear. His fear is that, he can't defend his vital installations. And, you have to imagine if you're MBS, for instance, and you have a city like Riyadh with 7-8 million people that relies very heavily on desalination, that is the boiling of seawater to produce fresh water. And if those plants are damaged, you have no water, and you would have to evacuate your cities. That's an existential crisis for Saudi Arabia. And that is why he was against this war.
Would Saudi Arabia not have seen a prize in a potentially weakened Iran? I'm imagining the conversations between him and the Trump administration or President Trump himself. Would it not benefit from a weakened Iran? I know you think that we're not going to end up with a weakened Iran, but would he have been tempted by that possibility?
Well, he has no love for the Iranian regime. There's a long history of animosity. But his main concern is not a weakened Iran, but an Iran that has no state or a failed state and that ends up in chaos and civil war. See, this is where the perspective of a country like Saudi Arabia is radically different from that of Israel. And I think this is where the United States shares more with Saudi than it does with Israel, because the Saudis see the Iranians as neighbors. They're not going to go away. And chaos in Iran would spill over into Saudi Arabia, whereas Israel is 1,000 kilometers away from Iran and doesn't care what happens there. So you have a very different perspective, a much more prudent view on the future out of necessity. I mean, this is not love for Iran. This is just pure pragmatism and realpolitik. And I think what MBS will be doing now is telling Trump that we don't want chaos in Iran.
Yeah, but he didn't manage to deter President Trump from being part of this and being right at the forefront of it. And yet,
correct,
from what President Trump has said, he seems to admire Mohammed bin Salman a lot. He likes him a lot. He said that publicly.
Yes, I mean, it is very true that Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel has prevailed in convincing President Trump that this war should be waged by the United States, and that MBS has not been able to convince Trump otherwise. President Trump came to political awareness in the 1970s when you had the two major oil crises of 1973 and 1979. He sees the Arab sheikhs as the richest and most powerful people who need to be cultivated, because that's what he saw in the 1970s with characters like Adnan Khashoggi and Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani and all these super wealthy Saudi
one an arms
oil
dealer,
sheikhs.
One the oil minister of Saudi Arabia for a time.
Correct. And he saw the massive transfer of wealth from oil-consuming countries to oil-producing countries. And Saudi Arabia became, one of the richest countries on the planet almost overnight. That's very appealing to President Trump. And I think he sees the Arabs as, the Arab sheikhs in particular, as sources of revenue for the United States. He doesn't see them as serious strategic allies or thinkers or influencers when it comes to U.S. policy, but rather as sort of cash cows, if you like, for the American industry and for the American economy.
And the other way, what does Mohammed bin Salman think of Donald Trump?
My suspicion is that he, look, let me put it to you very bluntly. A Saudi, this is not MBS, a very kind of well-connected Saudi told me that, you Americans can elect a monkey to the White House and we would have to like him. So the view of any Saudi leader when it comes to the United States is that you have to have a good relationship with the president. That's why they've almost always insisted that the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador in Riyadh, should be a personal friend of the president who can just pick up the phone and call him. They have to get along with the U.S. because they depend for their security on the U.S. Their investments are in the U.S. and their culture is oriented towards the United States. So, he has to deal with President Trump. And I think that my sense when I've asked MBS about the comparison between the Biden administration and the last year of the Biden administration, when relations got very warm with the Saudis, and President Trump, is that MBS had great appreciation for the institution-to-institutional relations that had developed between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. President Biden in his last year was negotiating 7 or 8 agreements with the Saudis. There had been very strong institutional links that had developed in that period. And that was something that I think MBS appreciated greatly. Now with President Trump, it's much more personal, much more transactional, and much less predictable. And I don't think that aspect of the relationship, however much MBS might like President Trump, the transactional quality and the fact that he can turn on someone very quickly, as we saw with Prime Minister Modi, for instance, recently over Russian oil sales, is not something that any Saudi leader would appreciate.
From your knowledge of MBS, will he also be resenting what this is likely to mean for his domestic agenda? He's in the midst of this big Vision 2030 transformation of his economy. He's got a large population. He needs to make sure that it's a properly functioning economy, not just an oil one.
Yes.
We can already see the impact on the region and potentially on the global economy from what's happening now. So does it actually threaten his whole agenda at home?
Yes. I mean, any chaos in the region, any instability, any, the flying of missiles and drones is very bad for the Vision 2030. This is economic diversification and the social transformation of Saudi Arabia that MBS has put into place. So he doesn't want wars anywhere. That's why he's been very keen to end the war in Sudan. He's very keen to also see stability in Yemen. He wants an end to the war in Gaza. For him, any chaos in the region blocks the vision that he has, which is that of an integrated economic zone in the Middle East that's comparable to the EU, and in which Saudi Arabia is the hub, and Saudi Arabia connects Asia to Africa and to Europe, and you have a logistics and tourism industry and tech industry that is thriving in Saudi Arabia. And so all of that is now in jeopardy. That's why he wants this war with Iran to end very quickly. He also, of course, wants a high oil price to be able to pay for all these projects of his. And, there's a temporary rise in oil prices, but it's not something that's sustainable. So no, he doesn't want to see this. He doesn't want to see chaos.
Can we talk about other relationships within the region, Bernard? And I'm thinking particularly about Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have had a very difficult period in the last few months, linked, well, you explain, but to Yemen and maybe an also broader rivalry between these two countries?
Yeah, I think that there is a rivalry and a competition between Saudi Arabia and the UAE that is both structural and personal. So at the structural level, there's a difference in size. Saudi Arabia is larger than Western Europe. So, Saudi Arabia is the 600-pound gorilla and wants the UAE and other countries in the region, the Qatars, the Bahrains, the Kuwaits, to defer to its leadership and to its size. There's also a difference in oil policy between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The UAE wants to produce a lot more oil. Saudi Arabia wants to contain the production of oil to maintain a floor on the price. There's, of course, competition over companies where their headquarters are going to be based. Saudi is the biggest economy in the region. There's competition over tech and all kinds of other things. And then there's also competition over the vision of the region. I mean, the UAE is a bit like Great Britain. It's trying to spread its influence through a network, a kind of a maritime empire, through a network of connections with different actors, some of them non-state actors, in Yemen, in the Horn of Africa, in Somalia and Somaliland, in Sudan. And this is something that the Saudis don't appreciate because they feel that this political ambition of the UAE is encircling them and is causing chaos, especially as the UAE backs non-state actors and separatist movements in these different countries. And then there's the personal difference between the two leaders as well.
Between Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed?
Correct, yes, who's the president of the UAE and the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi.
How are they different personally?
So the leader of the UAE thinks that he's the equal of MBS, and that causes tension. He also has a different view on policy. He's extremely aggressive. That is, MBZ is extremely aggressive when it comes to Islamists. He wants to crush them everywhere. He sees them as a threat. Whereas MBS, dislikes Islamists, but is willing to work with some of them in Syria and Sudan and Yemen because he sees the alternative to be worse. So he's more pragmatic when it comes to Islamism. And I think there are differences in temperament and personality.
And given that you do have these conversations with MBS, what surprised you the most as you started to get to know him that way?
So he's a fairly young person. He's 40 years old, and he's very, very charismatic. He really tries to get people to like him immediately and has a phenomenal sort of knowledge of everything and inundates you with information and data when you speak to him. He's a kind of techno-futurist. He's a bit like Elon Musk in that way. And some of that stuff, strikes me as not realistic. But his knowledge of the domestic politics and the regional politics is quite impressive. And I think also the way he is able to handle Americans is very impressive. I'll give you an anecdote about this. So there was an American delegation of Republicans and Democrats who wanted to visit him, and they did. The Democrats insisted before going into the room that they did not want to take photographs with him. They don't want to take selfies with him. Republicans were happy to take selfies with him. By the time the meeting ended, everyone, Democrat and Republican, were taking photographs and wanted to take photographs with him. So he can really kind of captivate people and turn them around in terms of liking him.
I imagine that this is quite recent, this incident. I mean, it'll be after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
Yes.
Which is probably why the Democrats didn't want their picture taken with him at first. I mean, he obviously has a problem with dissent, doesn't he? That's a country with political prisoners.
Yes, he's an authoritarian. And by the way, he doesn't conceal the fact that he's an authoritarian. And like all authoritarians, he will say, I had to be very harsh with dissent because I needed order and stability, given the massive transformation that I'm undertaking in the country, especially when it comes to questions of religion and women's rights. And so he justifies the repression through questions of order and transformation. That said, Americans and others have put pressure on him privately to release some of these dissidents and political and prisoners of conscience. And he has released about 1,000 of the 3,000 that are in prison over the last year and a half. And I think he has done this also for pragmatic reasons, because he's very conscious of the brand, the country's brand, and he wants the country to have a good reputation, not least to be able to attract tourists and to attract foreign direct investment. And so he knows that the human rights record, which is a bad one when it comes to Saudi Arabia. Incidentally, it's also bad for the UAE and almost all Arab countries, unfortunately, if not all of them, except for Lebanon, is bad for business. So he wants to improve that aspect of his country's reputation.
And of course, you mentioning Lebanon makes me conscious of your heritage. You were born in Lebanon, you grew up in Lebanon, and, well, I mean, it's had so many difficult times over the years, but you know all of this really well.
Yes.
I wonder, as you look ahead, do you feel a sense of apprehension for what comes next in the region, or is there a sense of opportunity somewhere in all of this?
Look, basically, you have in the Middle East a group of nations that are all, with the exception of Iran, allies of the United States. And the U.S. has to play a central role in pressurizing and making sure that these different countries get along with each other, despite their many differences. So you have Turkey, you have Israel, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Egypt. What happens with Iran is crucial for the future, but let's say you have a reformed regime in Iran that is less revolutionary. There's an opportunity, certainly, for the U.S. to bang heads together and make the countries of these regions work closer together and better together. But for that, you would need, for instance, the U.S. to put pressure on Israel to come up with a solution to the Palestinian question of statehood. You would need to also make sure that, tensions, say, between Saudi Arabia and the UAE don't get worse. You'd need to contain Turkey's expansion through the use of Islamism. So the U.S. has to play this key role as a mediator between these countries. And if it doesn't do that, I think that you will have perpetual tension, maybe not war as much as what we're seeing now, but a lot of instability and sources of radicalization, the most important of which is the question of Palestine.
And as things stand, not only is statehood very far away, but aid is not being allowed into Gaza. That was one of the impacts of this war breaking out.
Yes, and I think, from the Saudi perspective, let's say, there's going to be an election in Israel later this year. And the hope is that you end up with a less right-wing government that sees, now that, say, Iran has been put into a box and is less radical and less of a menace, that there's a possibility of a more tolerant view on the question of Palestine, and that the Israelis can finally come to some sort of accommodation with the Palestinians by realizing that if this problem is not solved, you'll always have repeated wars and repeated tensions and violence. And other countries, now maybe not Iran, but perhaps Turkey in the future, using the Palestinians to foment trouble for Israel.
And do you today feel more American than Lebanese? I wonder what your connection is at a personal level to the region today, when Lebanon's the place that you were born and brought up.
I do feel very American, and I feel like I am an American patriot, because this country has been wonderful to me and to my family. And I feel very sad and ashamed of Lebanon for the governments that we've had, and the fact that you have this remarkable community of Lebanese that is talented. We have the best human capital in the region. We have lots of money in the diaspora. The Lebanese could easily turn their country, which is one of the most beautiful in the world, into a paradise, and have not done so. And that's a source of sadness and frankly, of shame.
They have had a lot of outside meddling in the country.
That's right. But they've been willing to allow outsiders to meddle as well.
There was a photograph I saw on X, you've probably seen the same, which is of a Middle East Airlines plane taking off from Beirut airport just as airstrikes are coming in, which kind of says something about resilience and what you learn when you've been through cycles of conflict. Life has to go on.
Yes. I mean, the Lebanese are the most resilient people. And frankly, there are also other images where you see, say, people in one half of Beirut where there is no war playing tennis in swimming pools, and the other half of the city being bombed to smithereens during the Civil War. We've had scenes like that as well. And those again, are not anything to be proud of.
Professor Bernard Haykel, thank you so much for talking to us and for sharing so much knowledge.
Thank you.